Commune de Carthage today is a quiet, sunlit coastal municipality overlooking the Mediterranean, just northeast of Tunis. White villas and modern streets sit beside ancient columns and scattered ruins, where everyday life unfolds among layers of history. Palm trees sway above Roman foundations, and families walk past archaeological parks that once formed the heart of an empire. It feels less like a museum and more like a neighborhood that happens to stand on the bones of antiquity. Yet long before it became this peaceful suburb of modern Tunisia, Carthage was something far greater, until the year 1406 BC changed its destiny forever. Carthage was founded around the 9th century BCE, on the coast of North Africa, where the Mediterranean opened vast trade routes connecting 3 continents. When Rome was still a city, learning how to survive, Carthage was already a maritime power, wealthy, sophisticated, and confident. Carthage was not a weak city, nor was it a city destined to lose from the beginning. Carthage was the city that would not let Rome sleep, not because it occupied Roman land, not because it marched armies into the Italian peninsula from the start, but because as long as Carthage existed, Rome felt that its future was under threat. In the next 10 minutes, through vivid reconstructions based on historical and archaeological evidence, you will see why Rome did not merely want to defeat Carthage, but felt compelled to erase it from history. Because in human history, there are rare cities that are destroyed not because they lost, but because they were too dangerous to be allowed to survive. Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians, a people who did not build power from land but from the sea. The Phoenicians were neither an empire nor a unified nation. They were a collection of coastal city-states, originating from a region the Greeks called Phoenicia, corresponding to modern-day Lebanon and the Syrian coastline. Trapped between mountains and the sea, the Phoenicians could not expand through land, so they chose the ocean. They became the greatest merchants and sailors of the ancient world, building power through ships, harbors, and trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean. They did not conquer through armies but through contracts. They did not impose authority, but connected distant civilizations through goods, money, and writing. When the Phoenician city-states in their homeland weakened, one of their colonies in North Africa rose to inherit the entire legacy. That colony was called Carthage. Carthage was not a new city. It was Phoenicia, scaled to its largest, richest, and ultimately most dangerous form. To them, the ocean was not a boundary, but a road, not an obstacle, but a strategic advantage. Completely unlike Rome, where society was shaped by settled farmers, military obligation, and loyalty to territory, Carthage emerged from a different logic. It was not created by warriors, it was created by merchants. From its earliest days, Carthage was a city of crowded harbors, deep warehouses, accounting ledgers, and contracts signed in silence. Power here did not belong to those who held swords, but to those who understood the flow of goods, money, and risk. Carthage did not expand through loud conquests. It expanded through ships, networks, and the ability to connect distant regions into a profitable system. From North Africa, Carthage controlled grain supplies that fed major cities. From Spain, silver and precious metals flowed back like financial lifeblood. Sicily and Sardinia became strategic transit points where trade was protected and optimized. Carthage did not need to occupy deep inland territory. By controlling maritime gateways, it held the power of life and death over Mediterranean commerce. Carthage's influence spread widely, but quietly. There was no continuous imperial map, no borders drawn by armies. Instead, there existed a network of ports, agreements, and commercial relationships bound tightly together by shared interest. Money therefore flowed into Carthage steadily and sustainably, not as temporary spoils of war, but as long-term profit. The city grew rich in silence, rich without display, rich without proclamation. And it was this very wealth that planted the first illusion, a dangerous illusion. That wealth could buy security, that contracts could replace loyalty, that war, like trade, was simply a matter of cost. This belief helped Carthage rise quickly, but it would also place the city face to face with an enemy that never thought like a merchant. while Rome gradually built a society in which every citizen was a potential soldier, where bearing arms to defend the city was seen as a condition of existence. Carthage chose a completely different path. Carthage did not believe in citizen armies. It did not build identity on sacrifice or military honor. Instead, it outsourced war. For Carthage, war was not a sacred mission. It was an expense, a risk to be calculated, a variable in a profit equation. Rather than mobilizing farmers and craftsmen, Carthage paid mercenaries from across the Mediterranean. Iberians, Numidians, Gauls, Greeks. Battle-hardened, highly skilled soldiers, but not bound to the city by blood or ancestral memory. The logic of Carthage was clear. Why sacrifice citizens when money could be used instead? Why disrupt economic order when others could be paid to carry the violence? Within this worldview, Carthage believed that money could buy victory, money could buy loyalty, and money, ultimately, could buy security. For a long time, this belief was entirely correct. Thanks to immense financial resources from trade, Carthage maintained the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. They controlled sea lanes, protected merchants, and punished intruders. No need for contiguous territory. No need to proclaim supremacy. Only the assurance that every maritime route passed through Carthaginian interest. Carthaginian power was quiet, but efficient. No marching legions across land. No speeches calling for collective sacrifice. Only ships entering harbors, warehouses filling, and money continuing to flow. Carthage became the dominant naval power of the Mediterranean, without ever declaring itself an empire. Its authority existed in the smooth functioning of a system, one in which violence was a secondary tool, not the foundation. But this model concealed a fatal weakness, because war, when treated as a purchasable service, always has limits. Loyalty, when paid for with money, lasts only as long as the money holds. And security, guaranteed only by contracts, collapses when the enemy refuses to play by the same rules. While Carthage was optimizing its system, Rome was growing, slower, heavier, but armed with something Carthage never fully understood: the absolute survival instinct of a society willing to burn itself rather than be erased. And when these two understandings of power finally collided, the Mediterranean would no longer be wide enough for both to exist. Rome and Carthage were not merely two rival cities. They represented two completely different ways of seeing the world. Two incompatible logics of survival. For Rome, power began with land. With farmland, where citizens were born, worked, and stood ready to take up arms to defend their soil. The Roman army was not a hired force, but society itself in a state of permanent mobilization. Discipline, endurance, and the willingness to sacrifice tens of thousands of lives simply to continue existing. That was the essence of Rome. Carthage was the opposite. Its power did not lie in continuous territory, but in the flow of commerce. Not in military formations, but in contracts. Not in collective sacrifice, but in the optimization of risk. For Carthage, war was an economic variable, not destiny. When these two systems collided, war was no longer a choice. It became inevitable. The spark was Sicily, a relatively small island, but one positioned at the strategic heart of the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled Sicily controlled the trade between East and West. For Carthage, it was a lifeline. For Rome, it was the first door leading beyond the Italian peninsula. The First Punic War began as a regional dispute, but it quickly became a test of two models of power. Rome entered the war with a fatal weakness. It had no navy. While Carthage was the master of the sea, Rome had never ruled the ocean. Rome's solution was brutal in its simplicity. They copied a Carthaginian warship wrecked and washed ashore. The Romans dismantled it, measured every component, and built mass-produced replicas. Not perfect, not as refined as the original, but sufficient to learn. Rome did not need to be better than Carthage at sea. They only needed to endure longer. And they learned fast. The war dragged on for years, with catastrophic losses on both sides. But when it ended, the victor was Rome. Carthage was forced to sign a peace treaty, compelled to pay an enormous financial indemnity, stripped of much of its maritime influence. But money was not the worst loss. What truly wounded Carthage was humiliation. They, the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean, had been defeated by a state that had never been a naval power. They, masters of trade and calculation, had lost to a society willing to spill unlimited blood. Carthage paid in silver, but Rome learned something far more dangerous: that Carthage could be beaten. From that moment on, the relationship between the two cities was no longer competition. It became obsession. Rome did not forget, and Carthage did not either. The first war ended, but the seed of destruction had already been planted. Carthage did not merely produce an army. It produced a man who would haunt Rome for generations. Hannibal Barca. Hannibal grew up in the shadow of defeat and hatred. As a child, he was brought before the altar of the gods and made a vow that could never be taken back, to be Rome's sworn enemy until his final breath. But Hannibal was not a blind enemy. He did not merely hate Rome. He studied Rome. He understood how they fought, understood their discipline, understood that Rome would not collapse from a single defeat. And therefore, if Rome was to be defeated, it would require the unexpected. When the Second Punic War began, Hannibal did not choose the familiar path. He did not march his army across the sea, where Roman naval power had grown dangerous. He chose the route no one believed possible. Hannibal led his army across Spain, through hostile territories and into the Alps, a wall of snow-covered stone that Romans believed no army could cross. Alongside his soldiers, he brought war elephants, massive creatures never before seen on Italian battlefields. This was not merely a march, it was a test of will. Many died from cold, many died from hunger, many died in accidents along sheer mountain paths. But Hannibal pressed on. When he emerged on the far side of the Alps, Rome was stunned. They did not believe it could happen. And because they did not believe it, they were not prepared. The first victory came at the Trebia River. Hannibal lured Roman forces into unfavorable terrain, where discipline and formation became liabilities. The Roman army was shattered in freezing conditions, barely understanding how it had lost. Then came Lake Trasimene, one of the most perfect ambushes in military history. Roman forces were attacked from the fog, from the forests, from the hillsides. They were nearly annihilated before they could organize resistance. But all of this was only the prelude. The pinnacle of Hannibal's genius came at Cannae. Rome, panicked yet proud, decided to commit everything. They assembled a massive army, believing sheer numbers would crush the enemy. Hannibal understood this thinking perfectly. He arranged his forces in a curved formation, deliberately weakening the center. As Roman troops pushed forward, convinced they were winning, Hannibal's wings closed in. It was a perfect trap. The Roman army was completely encircled. No escape, no formation, no hope. In a single day, more than 50,000 Roman soldiers were killed. Senior officers fell. Noble families lost sons, brothers, heirs. Rome had never experienced a catastrophe like this. It was not merely a military defeat. It was a blow to the collective psyche. The entire city trembled. Fear spread across the Italian peninsula. In that moment, Rome nearly collapsed. Allies wavered. Faith in Rome's invincibility shattered. Hannibal had done what no one thought possible, defeating Rome on Italian soil, again and again. But the most terrifying thing was not the body count. It was the realization that for the first time in history, Rome could be erased. Hannibal stood at the threshold of history. He had achieved what no general before him had achieved. He had broken the Roman army. He had planted terror in the heart of a republic. The question was no longer whether Rome could be defeated. But this, would Hannibal dare to finish it? And it was at that moment that Carthage's fate began to turn down a path from which there was no return. And then came the decisive moment. The moment in which history allowed only one correct choice. Hannibal had won. Not one battle, not two, but a series of victories that shook all of Italy. Rome lost armies, lost commanders, lost faith in its own invincibility. The door to annihilation stood open. But Carthage hesitated. From Italy, Hannibal sent messages home. He needed reinforcements, resources, one final concentrated blow to shatter Rome while it was bleeding. Carthage did not respond like a state fighting for survival. They responded like a council of merchants weighing risk. They calculated costs. They feared losses. They hesitated to place everything on a single man, even one who had accomplished the impossible. They feared losing money, feared instability, feared making too large a wager. In their minds, war was still a calculation, a project requiring clear returns, an investment that needed limits. Meanwhile, Rome no longer calculated. They did not think in terms of profit. They thought in terms of survival. Rome accepted defeat in order to live. They accepted the loss of armies, land and honor, as long as the city itself endured. They changed strategy, avoided direct confrontation, prolonged the war, exhausted the enemy. Carthage did the opposite. They won, but did not dare to finish. They saw victory, but refused to pay the price to make it permanent. The moment passed quickly. There were no trumpets, no grand declarations, only the silence of a decision not made. And history does not forgive hesitation. Because in existential conflicts, victory is not enough. It must be concluded. Hannibal brought Rome to the brink, but Carthage pulled him back with its own fear. This mistake could not be corrected, could not be reversed, could not be compensated. From the moment Carthage hesitated, the balance shifted. Rome was not dead, and once Rome lived, Carthage had signed its own sentence. After surviving catastrophe, Rome did not return to what it had been. It transformed. What had once been competition became obsession. What had once been a balance of power was now seen as a danger. Rome reached a cold conclusion. Carthage could not be allowed to continue existing. No more discussion of territory. No more discussion of interests. No more discussion of treaties or reparations. There was only one objective left. In the Roman Senate, the same sentence was repeated again and again, like a political ritual, like a collective oath. Carthage must be destroyed. The sentence did not arise from immediate fear. At that time, Carthage was no longer at its peak. Its navy had weakened, its finances were drained, its influence had narrowed. But that was precisely what made Rome more determined. The problem was not that Carthage was still strong. The problem was that it had once nearly killed Rome. Rome understood a truth learned through blood. If an enemy has once brought you to the brink of collapse, then as long as that enemy exists, the danger has not ended. Carthage became an inescapable memory, a psychological scar, a reminder that Rome had once stood very close to death. And Rome refused to live in that state. They did not want Carthage to recover. They did not want another Hannibal to appear. They did not want to relive the moment when the entire republic trembled before extinction. From that point forward, Roman policy became absolute. No balanced diplomacy, no strategic tolerance, only eradication at the root. The Third Punic War was not a conflict between equal powers. It was a sentence already written. Rome did not go to war to win. They went to war to end. Not because Carthage had attacked again, not because of an immediate threat, but because Carthage's existence itself had become a threat. In Rome's survival logic, there are enemies who are not permitted a second chance. And Carthage was such an enemy. From the moment that sentence became policy, Carthage's fate was sealed. In 1406 BCE, Rome tightened its encirclement around Carthage. Not a swift assault, not a single decisive battle, but a prolonged sentence. The siege lasted 3 years, 3 years cut off from the world. 3 years without resupply, 3 years with no escape. Food gradually ran out, fresh water became a luxury. Disease spread through crowded districts, yet Carthage did not surrender. The city fought with everything it had left. Not only soldiers, but civilians, craftsmen, merchants, women, and the elderly. All were drawn into a desperate defense. When the walls were breached, the fighting did not end. It spread into every street. Carthage became a maze of resistance. House connected to house, rooftops turned into firing positions. Narrow alleys became traps. Every Roman advance had to be paid for. But Rome did not come to occupy, they came to erase. As Roman forces pushed deeper into the city center, the boundary between war and annihilation disappeared. There was no longer a distinction between military and civilian. No strategic objectives remained, only systematic elimination. Carthage burned for days on end. Structures that had once symbolized trade and wealth collapsed into flames. The harbors fell silent. Warehouses stood empty. Streets once crowded with ships and goods were reduced to ash. Survivors faced only 2 choices: death or slavery, sold and scattered across the Roman world, never to return home. Carthage was not merely defeated, it was erased from the political map. No government, no community, no voice left to tell its own story. Rome ensured that Carthage would never rise again as a rival, not through control, but by leaving nothing left to control. When it was over, Carthage no longer existed as a living city. Only ruins remained, and the memory of an enemy that had once made Rome tremble. This annihilation was not a spontaneous act of war. It was the outcome of a decision made years earlier, that Carthage, in any condition, must not be allowed to exist. And with the fall of Carthage, Rome sent a cold message to the ancient world. There are threats that cannot be managed, only completely erased. Carthage did not fall because it was weak. It fell after having once come very close to victory. And that is what made its defeat more bitter than almost any other collapse in ancient history. Carthage believed that money could replace will, that sufficient wealth could buy loyalty, that war, like trade, could be managed through cost, profit, and risk. For a long time, this belief carried Carthage to the height of Mediterranean power. But when faced with an existential war, that logic revealed its limits. Carthage also believed that victory did not require annihilation, that defeating the enemy was enough. That weakening, coercing, and returning to negotiation would bring greater long-term benefit than total destruction. They were accustomed to a world where conflict could be framed, controlled, and settled. Rome did not live in that world. Rome believed that some wars do not allow partial endings. That if an enemy has once brought you to the brink of collapse, that enemy must be removed permanently. Not to win, but to survive. Carthage's greatest mistake was believing that Rome would behave like itself. That Rome would calculate, compromise, and weigh costs. But Rome was not a merchant civilization. It was a society built on discipline, sacrifice, and an obsession with collective survival. Rome learned its lesson through blood. They learned that accepting defeat today in order to live tomorrow was acceptable. They learned that victory only matters when it cannot be reversed. And once they learned that lesson, they never forgot it. History, in the end, chose Rome. Not because Rome was more civilized, not because Rome was more moral, but because Rome was willing to go further to ensure that it would never face Carthage again. Carthage vanished, but its lesson remains intact. In existential confrontations, wealth is not enough. Victory is not enough. Reason is not enough. Only the will to end determines who is allowed to continue existing in history. Carthage no longer exists to tell its own story. No city survived to defend its memory. Only fragments remain, and histories written by the victors. But Carthage's lesson did not disappear. It echoes quietly through time, cold and unforgiving. In history, there are moments when strength, wealth, or talent are not enough to protect you. If you are dangerous enough to threaten the existence of another, then sometimes simply existing is already a sentence.